Welcome everyone to the webinar today. We're going to be talking about mental health and the discussions around it and the impact it has on our work. If you have any questions, feel free to share them in the Q&A box. We will take our time to answer them at the end of our conversation. Questions can be asked anonymously. We're also recording this webinar, so it will be shared on the Mighty Networks platform later on, so everyone that hasn't been able to attend the webinar live can watch the recording later. We're going to start with a short introduction of me as a host today, and then of Marcus, who's kindly volunteered to share his story. I'm Gijs Herpers. I've been working in Bangladesh for the past 6 years, been living there for 6 years and now 2 years in Malaysia. I do a lot of consultancy work for different NGOs, and by my own standards, I think I have had a pretty good and happy life. But there's also the shadow side of it. In 2014, I struggled with depression. Work became too much. It was impossible for me to manage everything. I was part of the project management of a big NGO project. We were working with 80,000 farmers trying to get their income up, which put a lot of pressure on me. It was a big team. It was my first real management job. A lot of things came together. And at one point I couldn't leave the house anymore. I didn't have the energy to go to work. And I looked for help, looked for a therapist who said it was depression, which then felt as it's quite a big shock. I think it still does at times. That's been 4 years ago. For me, it's been going with ups and downs since then. And I think one of the things I was missing was a space where I could discuss challenges, work-related, also with peers, which is why I requested Lawrence and Carlos to see if we could do something on the platform of the Happy Startup School that they've created. Because we're not the only one dealing with depression, not the only ones dealing with burnout. It is quite common, and it's quite difficult sometimes to actually talk about it and find the support you need. Based on that conversation, we started the Taming the Black Dog group on the platform, and I've also started chatting with people about how to create a space where we can talk about mental health, where it's not a taboo, where you can talk about it without the stigma. And Marcus was one of the people I talked to a few weeks ago, and I think it's interesting for him to share his story with the wider group. There's already a really nice interview on the platform done by Sophie. If you look for spotlight interviews on the platform, you can find it. So why did we ask Marcus to share a bit about his story? Marcus has gone through depression too, and has since then started touring around in Ruby, trying to strike up conversations about mental health and making that conversation accessible to everyone. And he makes podcasts, blogs, vlogs about the different conversations he has. Marcus will give an introduction into the project later on. Just to outline a few common principles of Taming the Black Dog, but also of the discussion today. We're a peer-run group, which basically means that none of us has a real background in psychology or psychiatry. And it also means that if you have serious mental health issues, we might not be the best people to help. We're not here to fix anyone, judge anyone, or save anyone. We're here to listen and to learn and to see if we can pick up things that can make our own life a bit better. Treat others as you would like to be treating, so that links a little bit back to the no judging part. we try to keep discussions open and transparent. If something triggers you, then please let us know. It's difficult for us to see who's behind screens, definitely without videos, and how it impacts you. If it's too much, if stories become too intense, let us know and we can tone it down a bit. It's a group. None of us individually can and will always be ready to support each other. But if you feel you need help, or you want to share your story, or you want to get ideas on how other people have dealt with issues, you can share it in the group on Mighty Networks. And the last one is take what you want, what you think is useful for your own life, and let the rest be. Just as a bit of a starting point for the discussion. If you have any questions, feel free to post them during the discussion. And I'd like to ask Marcus to give a brief about his project Ministry of Change and what it does.
Okay,
Marcus.
Can people see me, or can they just see the slide? I'm not sure how it works. Anyway,
no, they can see you too, but I'll make the video a bit bigger.
It's good with me. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I'll keep my introduction as quite brief, and then we'll go into sort of the questions and answers. But essentially, yes, Ministry of Change. That's my project, and really, it is a project exploring depression and anxiety, and also other mental illnesses, but or whatever we'll define them as. But it's exploring mental health in general, but really depression and anxiety are the focuses, because they're the things which I have personal experience of, having been through depression and anxiety, and also still experiencing them in different ways. And so it's looking at sort of the causes. I'm very interested in looking at the sort of the wider narratives that sort of exist in our cultures and in our societies, which sort of create these conditions where there are such high levels of depression. So I mean, how I do that is I have a van, that little red van that we saw in the slide earlier, and I drive around and I meet people and I share my story, but also I listen to their stories, and I have a podcast and a blog where I share other people's stories as well. So I think, so I mean, it really came from years of sort of not really understanding what was happening. I mean, I think if I really think about it, I can remember always having these sort of quite high levels of anxiety. And I guess these things which I'd probably now look back at and see as depression, but I didn't really know that as like a sort of definitely my late teens and in my early 20s at university. I really remember these feelings, but as I think a lot of people do, especially when I was in my late teens and early 20s, I basically combated those feelings through drugs and alcohol, which at the time seemed like a good idea. But like very soon, I mean, I started to realize that while I saw other people doing that as a thing, an outlet for having fun, I felt like actually, I don't know if I could sort of really have fun or be myself without them. And so I sort of started to sort of move away from that. And I guess like I always had this feeling of not being enough, this feeling, I guess, of not enoughness, which sort of went through my whole life. And I think it's easy to run away from that. And I did that through sort of substances for a bit, but also I spent a lot of my 20s moving from country to country, trying to find something which I felt I lacked within myself. So I lived in Asia, I lived in Hong Kong, and I lived in a couple of places in China. I was there in China for about nearly 5 years. And yeah, I came back to the UK a few years ago, and I felt like I really need to start like looking inside of myself. And I guess that's a journey I've been on for a few years. But I think it's sort of that time where I decided to sort of stop drinking and those sort of things, and really face up to what I was feeling, that I really started to notice what I would now really sort of obviously classify as depression. I think I always thought depression was something else, but when it happened to me, I realized it was this sort of feeling of just being completely empty, like completely had no sense of there being a future. I felt like the whole world was like this horrible place to be in. I didn't feel like I had a place in it anyway. And at the same time, I was sort of trying to build a freelance career, and I realized sort of depression, anxiety, and freelancing are really hard things to balance. I think there was a couple of years, or a year at least, where I was stuck in this horrible loop where I couldn't really, I felt really sort of depressed, but I also needed to pay my rent. So I needed to work because I was freelance. So I didn't have any like sick leave or anything. So I would eventually, after a few weeks, I would then start taking on jobs again. And then I'd feel stressed and anxious about that job. And then I'd feel depressed, and then I wouldn't be able to work again. And then I'd start to get worried about money. And then I'd take on more jobs, and then I'd have to stop work again. And for about a year, I was in this thing, and I just couldn't really see any way out of it. And I mean, I had lots of thoughts, like, I don't know if I really want to be part of this anymore. And eventually I had to say, I guess it was about like a year ago, just over a year ago, I realized that I needed to do something different. And I had this really good opportunity to be invited to be part of a project last year where we traveled around with a group of sort of teenagers, or late teens, early 20s, people, 15 of them. We took them, me and a friend, we drove around the UK on a bus, visiting intentional communities and purpose-driven projects, and met lots of people living in very different ways. And while I was there, I started to realize, oh, actually, like, there are a lot of ideas that I've had in my head, but I've just thought that I can't do that because I'm not good enough to do that. I don't have the skills to do that. There's a million excuses why I couldn't do a lot of the things I wanted to do. And I started to gradually unpick them as excuses. And I got back from this trip, this 6-week trip, and I sort of had this deeper understanding that there is actually a lot of agency that I have that I can do to change stuff, but I've just been too scared to do it. And I think that's the time that I really realized that real change is a painful process. I think change is painful because it requires letting go of things which provide some level of comfort, but don't always actually help you live the life that you need to live. So I realized that. So I did this sort of deconstruction process of my life, which was really painful. But through that, I gave birth to this project, Ministry of Change. And it's something I'd wanted to do for years, but there was always things about money and confidence that kept me back. And actually, I got to this point where I didn't care anymore about those things. So I just thought, I just need to do it. I just need to step out into the world and see what happens. And so that's sort of what I've been doing over this last year, is going on this very exploratory, emergent journey where I just sort of try and follow my intuition more, stay like more out of my head. And basically it's a learning journey and a big unlearning journey at the same time. And yeah, it's great. I think it's really taught me the power of what you can achieve if you let go of all the fears. Well, not even let go of all the fears, just recognize the fears and go do it anyway, basically. And a large part of that, this project and these last few years for me, has been getting to the point where I can just openly talk about the things that are going on inside my head and the things I feel and the things I'm projecting onto the world. And the more I do that, the more I've found that I find other people which are willing to do the same. And I realized that this world, which used to seem very dark and lonely, to me doesn't feel like that anymore. But it is a journey, and it is a journey. So it's not constantly, I don't always feel like that. I still have moments. But anyway, that's a very, very brief overview compacted down of like a whole life into a few minutes. So I've missed lots of bits out. And I'm sure there's loads more bits about the project that would be nice to talk about, but maybe it'd be good to sort of go into the more of the sort of the questions that you and the other people attending would like to know.
Yeah, thank you for your introduction, Marcus. Yeah, so one of my first questions that that I'd like to ask is it's often difficult to talk about mental health because also people have very different definitions from what it is. People go through very different experiences, and it came up in one of your the definition of mental health came up in one of your interviews as I think an obstacle of in talking about it. It was in your interview with Charles Eisenstein, and he talked about kind of the opposite of issues with mental health. Like if you're a whole person, then your mental health is okay. And I really like that definition of being whole or feeling whole. And you can fill in the details. What is the definition you're comfortable with, and has it changed over the duration of the project and your experiences with it?
Yeah, I mean that was really exciting interview. That was like one of the highlights of my life so far. I love that. But no, I agree with what Charles Eisenstein said. It's this idea of wholeness to me, and I think mental health itself, I think, is just, it's a term that, I don't know, in many ways it doesn't mean much. We all have mental health. Like I think often it's this weird thing where mental health is always followed up with like some issue or problem or something like it's something separate from ourselves. But actually mental health is just something that we all have, and we need to sort of just look after that in many ways. But yeah, no, I mean, I think the way I've been approaching it it's like mental health is this umbrella which makes it sort of easy to bring the focus onto sort of depression and anxiety, because that's what I'm interested in exploring. But I think really for me it's this much bigger sort of umbrella or ecosystem of sort of how we live our lives, but also like how the society is structured, and sort of things like sort of how the education systems work, how governance happens, how we relate to our friends and family and wider social groups and that sort of thing. I think they're all sort of part of this big package of what creates a whole healthy human being. And so, but I think essentially like mental health definition is just, it's something that's part of all of us. And so the idea that we should feel ashamed to talk about it, or that there's a stigma attached to it, it just seems sort of absurd to me. So I just continue to try and explore what that, and talk to other people about what their definitions of mental health are as well.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how in some of the conversations, in one of them you said the sane outcome in this world is to get depressed. If you see the way this world is, and you had a really nice quote on your Instagram of a play you were reading. If you live a long life and get to the end of it without ever once having felt crushingly depressed, then you probably haven't been paying attention. It's from Every Brilliant Thing. That perspective also resonated with me. How has it helped you from moving to seeing depression or mental health as an issue with yourself, to kind of being able to put some blame or cause of it with the outside world, and how that's functioning?
Okay. Yeah, well, firstly, that play, Every Brilliant Thing, it's very good if you're interested in sort of depression and suicide, that sort of thing. I think it's an amazing play. It really broaches that subject, but in a sort of humorous way, which sounds strange, but it's not when you read it. And I think it shows how powerful things like art can be to share messages with people. But yeah, to go back to your question, yeah, I mean, I think yeah, I mean, I feel like I've spoken to a lot of people now over the years, and I'm very clear that depression isn't something which is exclusive to me. But there was a time where I didn't realize that it was such a big thing in society. I felt like there's no one else could possibly be feeling how I feel. Like feel half like sort of a robot and half dead. Like I just feel like there's nothing really like human about me. I'm sort of pretending to be an adult. I'm pretending to be a person, and I can't imagine anyone that I see like at work or in the street or like in friend groups, they feel like this. But subsequently I felt like this. I realized that there's a lot of people which have these experiences of depression. So yeah, it's made it very clear to me that it's not something that happens in isolation. It's something bigger. And yeah, and then I don't know, I'm not sure if I use the word blame, but I do see how there's a lot of factors in the way that culture is and society is structured, which definitely don't help us live to be fully ourselves. I think, I mean, I can see quite clearly the correlation between sort of capitalism and consumerism, trying to sell us things and tell us we need more to be complete, and a feeling across a lot of people that they're not enough and they're not complete. I mean, that seems to be a message you're told from very young. I mean, things like at school, you're told like you need to constantly be like working harder to learn more, to get better grades, and that's something which persists throughout life. And I think like, I don't know, I'm very interested in exploring what other ways that we can live our lives are. Like think outside the box, and also just look at people that are living their lives in very different ways, in different cultures that live in different ways, and see what we can learn from each other.
There's a question from one of the attendees. Johan Hari in Lost Connections suggests that depression is a yearning for deeper connections, but many are deeply suspicious of admitting to their vulnerability, which perpetuates the disconnection. Which also links, I think, to your interview with Charles and his comments that wholeness is linked to intimate relationships. And the question is, after the project, after all these conversations, how have you started to believe in humans again?
Yeah, I think that's important. That's good. I think I've actually got I haven't read the Johan Hari book. I've read he's got a long article in The Guardian, which was amazing. And I've got it, actually, weirdly, I've got it being delivered today. So the person may even interrupt this call by coming to the door to deliver it. But yeah, no, I think that's a very important question to think about, like how I've started to believe in humans again, because there was definitely a point where I hated people and I hated society, and there was a point where I just didn't want to be like part of this anymore. Like I wanted to, like, I mean, even like the beginning of Ministry of Change was going to be something very different. It was going to be like my chance to sort of go away from society, like to get out and just spend time in nature and just talk to people that were like completely outside of like the mainstream culture. But I soon realized that while that's part of it, that wasn't like something that this isn't a quest to escape mainstream culture and escape society. It's actually a project to go into dialogue with what it means to be part of that and also be a balanced person. So, I mean, I think going out and talking to people, that was the big thing which helped me. I think a lot of the perceptions of what was going on in the world I had built up through the media and through the things I was reading and the things that like I was talking about, like, I don't know, in the pub or something, and it became part of this very cynical world. But as soon as you go out there and start to explore what are people doing to actually create a change, you start to see that there's so many beautiful people there. And I think also once you allow yourself to become vulnerable and start sharing your story, I found a lot of people naturally sort of began gravitating towards me to share theirs as well. And and it's through that. And I mean, being part of things like the Happy Startup community, I mean, I've been part of that for a couple of years, and I think like there's so many amazing people in this community which have helped me a lot. So it's finding the people that can support you, and you can do something different, and they don't necessarily need to 100% understand what you're doing, but they sort of get it anyway. Whereas a lot of times I think when I'm outside of like these communities, I struggle with that a bit, because I think people don't always understand what I'm doing, but they also aren't really interested in engaging in it either. So I think it's finding the like-minded people, your tribe, as they say. That's really helped me find sort of this new faith in that there are amazing people in the world. I can't hear you. Oh.
Yeah, sorry. You've spoken to a big range of people. Do you have any favorite conversations?
Yeah, I mean, I've got quite there's a lot I can think of. I mean, the Charles Eisenstein one was really amazing, because he's someone that he was sort of top of my list of people that I wanted to have on my podcast. But I just thought, like, I'm not like, he's got lots of books, and I listen to his podcasts, and I'm like just this one man show. I'm like, I'm professional, I'm just small me. Like, I have to wait for a long time before I can have the confidence to contact people like that. And then he happened to be sitting opposite me at lunch a few weeks ago at an event, and I just plucked up the courage. I thought, like, oh, like, I'm really scared that he's going to say no, but I'm more scared that I won't ask and will always regret that. So I asked him, he said yes. So that was amazing, just to have that conversation with someone that I respect so much. But then I've had lots, like, I mean, there's been my friend Max, who some people in this community will know. He's a Qigong. He teaches Qigong and does a lot of other sort of really amazing things about sort of how he calls it how to fight well, to how to sort of deal with sort of conflict in a healthy manner. He was a really interesting person to talk to. I've had conversations with people around permaculture, which is quite interesting, and I think I found it really useful. It's a really interesting way to sort of approach mental health through sort of how you can sort of change your relationship to nature and the environment. And what's some of the more recent ones? Recently, I've been like talking to quite a few people about alternative education, which I think has been really eye-opening and really positive. Like, to see some of the things that people are doing with younger people to sort of allow them to be themselves and be vulnerable at a much earlier age, and also to sort of change the approach of having someone at the front telling you what the answer is, to working in dialogue with each other in circles and sort of sharing and actually coming to decisions in community. So they've been some really interesting conversations. I mean, I don't think there's anyone I've spoken to which I haven't had an interesting conversation with. A lot of them are people who are just sharing their story of their experience with mental health and how they experience the world. And almost everyone I speak to in that context starts off by saying, I'm a bit nervous to do this because I don't really think that I have a very special story. And then their story is always sort of completely mind-blowing. So I think everyone has a story, so it's just lovely to talk to anyone, really.
I hope that answered the question we got. If you would like any clarification, then let us know. Talking about everyone's story, everyone's experience with mental health is different. Everyone goes through ups and downs. Do you see a need change for the conversation during those ups and downs?
I don't know if this answers the question, but I mean, I think one of the big learnings for me over the last few years has been to sort of change my perspective of life from a linear process to a more cyclical process. And I think that's a really big thing, which I think can really help change the conversation on mental health, is that we're not like, there's not like this goal that we're constantly building towards. I think that actually, as with all areas of life, our mental health is in constant change, and it's in this dance with all the other factors in our lives, the things close to us, our personal relationships, but also in a wider context of what's going on in the world. So I think that it's this idea that we are moving towards a higher state of constant happiness. Maybe that's something which it's healthy to sort of change that approach to, or a different understanding of what happiness is. For me, like, I used to think that I was aiming for sort of constant happiness, and that means that every moment you're not happy is sort of a failure. But actually now I have a much deeper understanding of what happiness is to me, and actually it's fleeting, that real feeling of sort of elation and whatever that is. But actually I can see that, like, my life is much happier, but that actually, to get that, you need to be able to sort of go to all the places and experience all the emotions. So as a result, it's also seemed that at times that what's happening in my life is much more difficult and much more, I don't know, I have to go to some of those darker places. So yeah, I think that I'm not sure really, but I mean, I think one of the biggest things is the idea that, like, it's okay to feel how you're feeling, and that it's not that it's, yeah, I mean, to not sort of judge yourself on that, and to realize that you're not alone in it. And so I think, like, I mean, the biggest change I'd like to see in the conversation is just that it's not a taboo thing. Like, I think it's strange that you're sort of not allowed or feel not able to talk about sort of these things. Like, I mean, I still find it hard sometimes to sort of use, if I'm meant to be doing something, to ring someone up and say, actually, I can't come today because I just feel so full of anxiety, or I just, like, feel completely like I don't want to talk to anyone. And that's quite hard to do, but it shouldn't be. And so I try to be honest with that and not make up excuses why I can't go, but actually say why I can't go. And I'd like to see that in workplaces as well. I mean, I'm lucky because I'm freelance, but so I don't know if I'm lucky because I'm freelance, because it still means that I work with people, but I work with new people all the time. So actually I'm having to broach that sort of conversation more often. But I think I have the benefit of, like, my work, I work as a facilitator as well in communities. And I think the benefit of my other work with Ministry of Change is that, like, they usually know already that I do these explorations into mental health. So there's already an opening for that conversation. So, and like, I mean, I can't really hide I can't really hide it when I have all this stuff on the internet easily searchable about what I do. But I don't really mind that, because I feel it's just important to be able to talk about it.
In one of your blogs, you even say that conversation is one of the things in your toolkit on how to deal with the depression. So besides meditation, besides your exercise, you see conversation as an important element in that box. So when I feel low, striking up a conversation is definitely not on my list of things to do. How do you use it in these moments?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's important to remember that there's not any one tool that works every time at any particular time. I mean, sometimes the best thing to do is to just, if things are getting are too much and you don't want to engage, sometimes it's okay to disengage and just to be with yourself and not to worry about that. But yeah, I mean, I guess what I mean is, for me, the very start of this journey was really when I began to be able to talk about it. Like I would pretend that everything was all right. And I mean, it was eventually like when it became so obvious that it wasn't, that it was, I mean, what sort of, I remember it was a couple of years ago now, but it was my mum and my girlfriend at the time. They would start to say, you need to do something. But I just felt too much like I couldn't talk about it with any sense of rationality. And it was only like when I started taking those first steps into sharing how I felt, I could feel this weight being lifted. And once I started doing therapy, that was another big shift, talking to a stranger about how I felt. And that, I think from there, I soon started, I think at first I mainly wrote about it because I felt that was an easy way to sort of process it and put it out there without being so face to face. But now, like I just talk to people when I can. But yeah, in those, I find for me, it's about talking about it. So as a way of sort of processing it and making those times where I feel either really anxious or really depressed come less often. So actually, if I can start to feel like, I can feel like these like mist in my mind and these dark clouds forming, it's then that I will be able to hopefully be able to say to someone like, this is how I'm feeling right now. And so this is why I can't do what we've got planned. And this is why actually the best thing I can do now is go back to like home and not having more conversations. So it's that but that's what I mean. It's about being able to share share how you're feeling and not feel bad about that. I mean, but actually sometimes when I'm in those sort of in the like, I don't know how to describe it really, but like at the bottom, like really in the middle of the storm. Yeah, I'm not saying that then it's like a time where I'll necessarily be able to have a conversation. That's sort of the time where it's too late and I just have to let it like ride it out and somehow. I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer.
No, it's it's an answer. In one of your latest blogs, you talk about how all these different conversations have made you see the importance of storytelling, and you talk about storytelling on a personal level. I think so. Everything that has happened to you that you feel has a spot. Storytelling in the community. So, or as a collective, I think so. You're supported. You have that group around you, and you talk about the wider narrative, the story about the society as a whole and how society as a whole looks at mental health. How does that relate to how you view your work? Do you consciously try to build in these different levels also in professional situations? Or is it something that resonates more on a personal level?
No, I mean, I think with this project, yeah, I sort of just like last summer when I started, I just knew I needed to start. I knew I needed to explore the sort of depression, anxiety, and I needed to take a much more hands-on approach to explore it for myself. I needed to get up and go out into the world and explore it, but I didn't really know what that was. So rather than doing what I would usually do and try and plan out what that would look like, I just sort of started doing it. And then more recently, as it came to like about almost a year of doing that, I sort of took a step back and tried to analyze sort of what are the bits that I've got out of this most, what's the thing I feel most attached to. And it was and it always comes back to the storytelling thing. And actually that was something I was doing before the project anyway, but I think I didn't really attach the two together. But then I could definitely see these three strains of it, which one of them was the power I found of telling my story, of how that, for me personally, how that felt so like therapeutic and important thing for me to do, to be able to process how I was feeling. But also I started to see through feedback how helpful other people had found that. Then there's the second thing I talked about in that blog post was the idea of the collective storytelling. So that was sort of the same thing, but it's the power I can see with when more and more individuals start sharing that same ideology and start sharing their own experiences with how they're experiencing the world. So that's not necessarily through just depression and anxiety, but like the ups and downs of their own life, and how that creates this sort of shared space where these stories begin to sort of take on a life outside of the individual and become this thing with ripple effects which can have tremendous power for transformation. And then the third aspect of it I saw through the conversations and through the explorations have been, what is the wider narrative that this is all working in? So that is the sort of, actually it was in that conversation with Charles Eisenstein, he said something that really resonated with me. He was like, I'm going to paraphrase it because I can't remember exactly, but it was how often we treat things like depression and like things around mental health as a medical issue, but actually that's just the medical thing is just picking up the aftermath. But actually, when we talk about a lack of wholeness, it's a political, it's an economic, and it's a social problem. So it's looking at those wider narratives and how it can change them. So I guess the next phase, which I'm beginning to explore now, is how to merge autobiographical storytelling with more ideas around sort of myth and this oral tradition of storytelling, like I don't know, like sort of fairy tales, myth, those sort of things, which I think can hold this greater sort of societal context and go deeper and explore sort of human emotions and human connections on a more like sort of timeless and deeper level. But as I say, I'm just sort of really early into those explorations, but it's something I'm so excited about. So I've forgotten the question now. I got excited, but yeah.
How these things also relate to work, and if you build these stories into work as well.
So I mean, I build them into my work. Yeah, I mean so that sort of that thing I just discussed is sort of how I've sort of started to like see how I frame the work that I'm doing. But I suppose your question, how do I do it? How would other people frame that into their own work?
Yeah, so say if you facilitate community sessions, right? The other part of your work. Do you bring these stories on different levels into that work?
So yeah, I mean, a lot of the things for facilitating in my work. Yeah, I mean I'm an art of hosting practitioner, and art of hosting is this sort of process of helping people ask the right questions and have have the conversations that really matter. And so a lot of that brings in definitely personal storytelling into that, because I feel that if you're, say, going into a meeting, either with people that you work with every day or people that you don't really know, I think it's completely changes the dynamics if you all know how people are showing up and what they're bringing. So I mean, I'd always start off like all my group sessions with a sort of very brief sharing circle, sort of a check-in of how they're feeling. But then within that, I think a lot of even when they're discussing sort of particular projects, it's talking about sort of bringing in their own life experience, and so through that's sharing their experiences and how they've sort of been, what their cultural background is, what their professional experiences, what their personal experiences. So I'll try and bring that all in, because I think if you can show up as your full self and not hide the important bits, then people can actually learn they have empathy, and they can work together better, and they know how to sort of balance each other and who's going to work well in what situation and who's not. And I think it's important. So yes, I bring that into my work all the time.
So there's a big party starting here, so I hope the sound is still good and everyone can still hear me. I had one last question, so I'm wondering if there's still questions from any of the attendees. Otherwise, I'm gonna start with my final question. One of the things you also did was a small video on reclaiming Cornwall from depression. You went there when it wasn't going so well. You went back to see if those feelings would change.
Yeah.
Do you think it's important to keep rewriting your own story? Because one of the things that I noticed is that you talk about how in your memory it was all dark and gloomy, and when you went back, you also remembered there were like happy moments and it wasn't all so bad. Yeah, how important is rewriting that story?
Yeah, I mean, I for me, and personally, it's important to go back and frame them. I knew this. I mean, the sort of story behind that was, it was, I guess, nearly 2 years ago now. I was in this sort of I was living in Brighton, and I had this really, really sort of few weeks where I just couldn't really do anything. I just lie on the floor and I like cry sometimes, and just it was really sort of this really sort of big period of depression, and I thought I had a holiday planned to go to Cornwall, and I thought like, oh, it'd be a good idea. I'll just do that because that'll help me, the change of scenery. But actually, it made it. I think it made it worse because I was there and I was surrounded. It was, I think, May or June. It was sunny. It was the holiday season just starting. And I was in St Ives, and I felt like I'm meant to be happy, but I feel like I want to die, and it was horrible. So, but then I left, and then like a year or so later, I was thinking like, oh, I haven't been back to Cornwall, and I still associate that with that. When I think of Cornwall, I just think of depression. So I thought, I feel like I need to go and sort of explore that again. So I drove back and spent like a few days in Cornwall by myself, just going to all these places that I had in my memory, and then sitting in those places, like physically sitting in those places, and I guess sitting with myself and thinking, how do I feel now? And realizing, okay, yeah, like that's not, that was a version of myself at some point felt like that, but I don't feel like that anymore. So it's very important to me, because I think sometimes I find on these, when you're sort of doing the inner work, it can be hard to see because there's not any sort of physical milestones or like external things that someone's going to hand you a award or a medal or like a promotion for getting to another stage of self-acceptance. So it's sometimes hard to see that it's happening at all. So that was important for me to go back and to be able to sort of actually see some of the sort of the changes that I felt inside of me more sort of in a more sort of what's the word? Just to feel them stronger. But then then when I was there, as you say, I did start to remember periods, albeit brief, while I was there, that actually I did something which I would bring back a smile or bring back oh, that was actually nice. And so I realized that, oh yeah, like, well, I think it was 4 days. I was like, well, the overarching feeling of those 4 days was one of complete despair and misery. It wasn't all that. There were pockets in there of really good, like happy things which happened. And I think that was what felt important to me. It's that like often these really strong emotions or lack of emotions can define your experience because they sort of overwrite in your memory. They wipe out all the other ones. So it's good to go and explore and rewrite them. But I think it's also important to, going back to the beginning, it's important to notice that sort of cyclical approach where like actually it's not this like upward trajectory, it's a constant sort of back and forth between how you're feeling. But actually I find the more I can be open and vulnerable and talk and share and be willing to go to those sort of more the more difficult emotions, the actual when I do have periods of anxiety and depression, they last a lot less time, and they come a lot less often.
Thank you. One final question from one of the attendees. The natural world has a place for everything, where each of the parts have a value to the world. Do you think you're finding a place for yourself in the world now?
Sometimes I think that. I find it hard. Like, I mean, I talk to my therapist once a week, and I was actually talking about that yesterday. How, I mean, sometimes I feel so connected to this, like deep down, I know that. So talking about mental health, trying to help other people sort of find their place in this world, and also, I mean, the big passion I have is for like suicide prevention. I mean, I've been affected by that from at a personal level, and I think I know that deep down that this is something that I need to do. That I'll do it whatever. I don't need to focus on like exactly what that will look like all the time. I know that it's always going to be a part of my life, and I feel that has given me some very deep sense of purpose. But then other times I don't feel like that. Like I feel panicked, and I feel anxiety coming back, and I feel like the external world creeping back in, and I feel like, oh, like maybe I should be focusing more on like sort of building my career, or like getting more money, getting like buying a house, like these sort of like external factors that I start to panic. And I've realized that, like, I guess I spent a long time living just in a very like sort of analytical world where everything was coming from my head, and now I just try and live a lot more from my heart. And I know that the more I can do that, the more I can I can actually navigate the world with like effortlessly in a way. And by effortlessly, I don't mean easily. I just mean that like I can sort of sense what I need to do. And I think that's helped me find a role for myself in the world. But it's just being able to sort of trust that process, trust myself and love myself, which is something that I constantly I'm trying to keep in my awareness, because it's easy to forget that when the real world comes knocking on your door.
Yeah, I like the concept of seeing it in a circle. It goes up, it goes down, but you'll have to live with it. It's not like you can take it on be gone.
Did that answer the person?
Something that stays with you, I think. I hope so.
Yeah.
If not, let us know. Thank you, Marcus, for sharing. For everyone listening in or watching the recording later, there's a few ways to stay in touch with us. If you like what Marcus has to share and you want to stay up to date of his journey, you can visit his website, listen to his podcast, or support him on Patreon. I'll make sure we post the links together with the recording. If you'd like to stay involved within the Happy Startup School, you can join the group we set up called Taming the Black Dog. You can look for it with the search function. Marcus and I will both be at summer camp next weekend, so you can come and have a chat with us there, or send me a message if you'd like to know a bit more. Marcus, thank you very much for your time. It was very interesting.
Thank you.
Talking to you. I hope everyone picked up a few things that are useful for themselves. Yeah, thank you very much, and looking forward to continuing the discussion in person next week. Thank you.